Hello there. Welcome. My name is Lindsay Robinson. I'm the Executive Director of CCIA. Hopefully, I've had a chance to meet those of you joining us today. This is a member-only legislative wrap-up session with our Senior Policy Director and Lobbyist, Amy Jenkins.
Hello.
We've got more people coming into the room. I know we're going to have some board members on today, and Eddie Franco is here with us behind the scenes, as well as Justin McCarthy and Josh Drayton. So we're excited to have everybody today. We'll get into it, plow through things in just a moment here. We'll give it another minute for folks to hop on. But we're excited to be hosting this webinar today. Some of you probably had a chance to check out our membership meeting that we do twice a month. We hosted our last one on Friday, and that was open to all members. And 2 weeks from last Friday, we'll be hosting our business and executive level membership update. So now that we're done with the end of the legislative session, we reflect on where we've been and what little we've been able to accomplish despite hard efforts. And we start planning for 2021. So I know a lot of you have been through this process with us in the past, and hopefully you'll take the opportunity to engage and communicate with us via our committees or even directly with any of our staff about policy priorities. So we're going to do a deep dive today into where we ended up at the end of the session. Couple things to note is that you can submit questions using the question tab here on the module. I just pointed to it like we're all in the same room. It's on the right side of your screen. Go ahead, send us any questions you might have, and we'll certainly pause throughout the webinar to answer any questions we can, and shed light on anything that you all would like to know. So also this is being recorded. So if you would like to, catch up with it at another time, that'll be available on our website, as all of our webinars are. So anything we record for our members is available there. Yeah, I think we're ready to take it away. We've got a nice little PowerPoint today, but we're also going to make it a little bit informal and try to have kind of some open conversation around some of these items. So Amy, take it away.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everybody, on this kind of an apocalyptic afternoon. I don't know about the rest of you, but I had to get a new light because it is so dark where I am right now. But it's nice to take a little time away from the craziness outside and share what accomplishments we have been able to achieve in this very odd legislative year. And I think, as Lindsay indicated, there weren't as many as we would have liked, but there were certainly some accomplishments. And frankly, I will say that I think next year is probably going to be one of the most involved years for the cannabis industry, with a lot of things that are on the horizon, consolidation, and as well as some other items which we'll cover today. So again, appreciate your support and participation. And we welcome any and all questions that you may have. I will do my very best to provide as much detail as I can, though I think that'll largely be based on whatever questions that you throw my way. So I did prepare a PowerPoint with Lindsay and Eddie's support, so we'll kind of walk through that as really a guide. But again, as our members, we welcome your input and any questions or concerns throughout the presentation. So having said that, we'll go to the first slide. Please, Eddie. Okay, so I just thought this is kind of going backwards a little bit, but thought we would start with providing a bit of an overview on where we were and then ultimately where we ended up. So really going into this year, we had a lot of ambitious items and policy objectives that we intended to cover, including some retail expansion work that we were doing with Assemblymember Ting and some other policy makers in Sacramento. We were poised to work on tax reduction. There was a lot of conversation around the elimination of the cultivation tax. and frankly, a lot of buy-in from the legislature. As we know, the governor announced in his January budget a plan to simplify the tax collection process. And while that ultimately became somewhat controversial, there was a lot of dialogue underway in early January and February about what was in fact possible around tax collection and what that new framework might look like. And then we were also talking about a lot of streamlining of regulations, and this largely centered around agency consolidation, as the budget announced that the governor was poised to essentially merge the 3 cannabis licensing entities into a single department, the Department of Cannabis Control. And then there was a lot of conversation around equity and additional removal of barriers to entry so we can really address the very robust unlicensed market that we're still dealing with. So those were really our objectives going in. There was a lot of conversations with the administration at the start of this legislative season and a lot of enthusiasm. And then obviously things changed pretty dramatically in March. So next slide, please. Eddie. There we go. So really quickly, obviously we had to shift our focus, and that was a very abrupt transition that happened almost immediately. And so our policy goals, along with the pandemic and the fact that we were all forced to shelter in place, really changed quite dramatically over a very rapid period. So in lieu of our very ambitious policy goals, we kind of ratcheted down. But I think you'll see throughout the conversation today that we really did our due diligence and tried to do our best in terms of meeting some of these objectives. But again, it was much more moderate and modest in terms of our goals. And so that was really about preserving existing retail access. So we were working on, curbside and a lot of different efforts with the administration. We began to rethink a lot of the work that we were going to be doing around regulations, and really wanted to focus on streamlining that in ways that reduce cost pressures and barriers to entry on the industry. Existing cannabis tax rates was another goal that we developed post shelter in place. And then a lot of focus around future state stimulus efforts. There was a lot of dialogue about that in June, and we'll cover that briefly. And then banking access. So that was really our attempt to pivot and adjust to the new environment that we were finding ourselves in. Now, before we go to the next slide and I talk a little bit about finances and how things are looking right now from a revenue standpoint, I do want to say too that I think it would be a disservice, I think, to all of us to not recognize the fact that the essential business designation was a huge victory for the industry. And I was very pleased to work with a lot of you on a county by county basis at the onset of those discussions when the counties were starting to institute shelter in place. We had some very early setbacks that I think with a lot of good organizing that was done locally, we were able to overturn. And I think of communities like San Francisco and Alameda and even Santa Clara, where we were able to flip those folks. And what I would say is I don't know if we would have been as successful at the state level had we not put in a lot of that work. So you were all very much involved with that process. And I think that is something that we should celebrate as an achievement this year, though I know it's difficult as we're still in this environment to recognize the significance of that. But we had different industry groups calling us all over the nation asking us how we did it. And it was in large part due to the organizing that you did locally, which helped us lobby the governor's office to get that essential designation. So I didn't want to not address that very briefly. So next slide, please. So I just wanted to include this piece because I think it's really important. What I find, and even with myself, is it's not always readily available what we generate in terms of cannabis tax revenues. And I put this in there for a very strategic reason, which I'll cover on the next 2 slides. But I just wanted to highlight, in the context of taxation and all the concerns that we have kind of where we stand and what the revenue picture looks like. These are the first three, 17, 18, 18, 19, and 19, 20. Those are actual revenues that have now been reported. I would note that in all 4 fiscal years, including the projections for fiscal year 2020, 2021, the legislature and the governor had to adjust down. So just as an example, the 2019-20 fiscal year, the original projection was 479 million, and the revenue projections in 2020, 2021 are going to come in lower than the prior fiscal year, but those original projections were 550 million. So, you know, I think this is really one of many messages that we're conveying, that will continue to convey, that we're not generating the revenue that the state has anticipated, and those will be ongoing discussions that we'll continue to have in the next fiscal year as we talk about opportunities to reduce the cannabis taxes, which will continue to always be a core priority for the association. So next slide. So I wanted to just also cover this really quick, and then we'll get into legislation. But this is also an important piece, because what we saw in 2019-20 fiscal year, which concluded at the end of June, was the first year that the full revenues generated from cannabis taxes were allocated. And for a lot of you who may not know, there's essentially 3 buckets, which are also referred to as tiers. So tier 1 essentially covers the administrative work being done by the licensing entities and other state agencies to support MCRSA. And then tier 2 are specified allocations for University of California for cannabis efficacy and other dedicated programming. But the tier 3 bucket is the really interesting bucket, and this is where the bulk of the excess revenue is allocated and spent, and it's quite considerable, and it's a lot more discretionary. And I want to kind of dive down into this a little bit just to give you a perspective, which I think is going to help me rethink some of our framing next year as we're talking to the legislature. But essentially the tier 3 bucket, next slide, is divided into 3 essential components. So it's youth education, prevention, early intervention and treatment, environmental restoration and protection, and state and local government law enforcement account. What you guys may not know is, again, the 2019-2020 fiscal year was, again, the first year that all of that funding was allocated to different state entities. So for instance, out of that beige bucket, you'll see the 178 million, 60.3 million of that went to essentially support childcare in California. So when you start to think about a lot of the conversations we were having in the legislature, and even conversations we're going to have next year, there is a lot more interest in our revenues and a lot more constituent groups that are either desiring our revenues or that are now benefiting from cannabis tax revenues. So for those of you who were tracking in detail some of the deliberations and conversations we were having in Sacramento, we started to get pushback from public employee groups and others who were benefiting from this revenue. And so I think that's going to be an ongoing conversation and challenge that we're going to have in the coming year. And so a lot of the work that I think CCIA is really starting to think about is how we really demonstrate how a reduction in taxes is going to mean an uptick or an infusion of new revenue. But we're going to really have to focus on some of the economics of that. And I'm hoping that some of the partners we work with, like ArcView and BDS and a lot of other groups out there, could really help us kind of develop some of that data, because that's really going to be essential as we go into this next legislative year to really help build and make those tax arguments, now that we have a lot of different groups who are benefiting from our tax revenues, good, bad, or otherwise. But I thought it was important for you to be aware of that. So that's kind of a basic overview of kind of what things look like from a revenue perspective. And now we'll talk about a couple other budget highlights on the next slide. So essentially what happened this year is we were looking at about a $54 million budget shortfall when COVID hit. In addition to that, we saw, we saw a lot of delays or efforts to delay some of the fiscal work that is normally done. So we had a much more consolidated and streamlined budget. And what that ultimately meant was that the governor ultimately opted to postpone any sort of consolidation conversation, so the agency consolidation, and then also the tax simplification or streamlining concepts. All of that were tabled essentially when the governor introduced his new budget in May. But there were some small little nuggets in there that we certainly wanted to celebrate that I want to highlight with you right now. Now, just to note, I'll get into kind of what we see happening next year, and that will include consolidation and tax simplification, among other things. But this is what was accomplished in the budget that was approved and took effect on July 1. So first, we saw something called coordinated enforcement. And I would note, I think there was a lot of confusion out there among industry as to what that in fact meant. I think the assumption was that it meant that the state was really enhancing and bolstering its enforcement efforts, and there is some truth to that. But I think what the real intent was to eliminate this bifurcated enforcement construct that we were currently operating under before July 1, and that was having one division within Department of Consumer Affairs essentially charged with enforcing against unlicensed, and then the Bureau and the other two licensing entities enforcing on licensed operators. So what this coordinated enforcement concept that was approved did is it basically shifted all of that under the jurisdiction of the Bureau of Cannabis Control. So that meant 58 existing investigators just moved from one department to the Bureau. This was also considered the first step towards agency consolidation, which again is going to happen presumably in 2021. And there's a lot of groundwork underway behind the scenes as the licensing entities are working to develop what that framework is going to look like, and a lot of opportunities. So we'll talk about that a little more. The other thing we were able to get in there was a resource laboratory. This was something that was raised a couple times in CCIA's communications with Chief Ajax, that she really wanted to develop a resource laboratory for purposes of addressing some of the challenges associated with uniform testing, so that we weren't looking at 5 different test results from 5 different labs. And I know that's a big concern with respect to category 1 testing, where we have a detect, non-detect, but no specific metrics. So I think that the Bureau Chief felt that it was really important that the Bureau itself have a resource laboratory that they could stand up so that they could really start developing some of those metrics and best practices. So we were very pleased to support that effort, and that was funded in the budget. Social equity, again, social equity was also funded at $15 million. This was represented about a 50% reduction from the prior year, where it was funded at $30 million. And we know some of the first allocations were divvied out in June with additional allocations forthcoming. I think social equity is going to continue to be a huge priority for CCIA. We were certainly at the table advocating for those funds, and hopefully as we go into the next year, we'll assess the state's fiscal picture and continue to advocate for that existing amount, if not more, if we can. Obviously, that'll be at the discretion of our board. But social equity was funded at $15 million, and we're going to continue to push for that. And then one unknown, or less known provision that we worked on with the International Cannabis Farmers Association was this Legacy Farmer Grant Program. And that is really still under development, but it'll be funding and a program developed under the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And the objective is to fund small grants to legacy cannabis farmers and impacted watersheds. So we know that there was a lot of challenges with trying to meet the state compliance requirements when legacy growers are seeking licenses. There are a lot of environmental components to that are very costly. So this is a grant program that will be stood up in the next couple of months to provide grants to small farmers to try to meet some of those environmental compliance requirements. Next slide, please.
Hey, I'm going to pop in real quick and just welcome those who have just hopped on the webinar. This is CCIA's legislative wrap up. We're happy to have you. If you have any questions throughout, please feel free to use the panel on the right-hand side to submit your questions. We'll try to get through all of them. But yeah, just want to make this as interactive as possible, and we're glad that you're here.
Yeah,
Back to
thanks,
you,
Lindsay.
Amy.
Thanks, Lindsay. And please know I welcome questions, because sometimes I worry not seeing you guys. I worry that I'm either putting you to sleep, and I also just get tired of hearing my own voice. So I'm perfectly happy to take any and all questions today. So we talked a little bit about budget. So now I want to roll into some of the legislative highlights. Again, very, very modest year. So certainly want to emphasize that this is certainly not the same level of work that we experienced, although I didn't feel like I was short of work, but in terms of legislative package, it ended up being very small. And before I kind of get into the 6 remaining bills that actually made it to the governor's desk, I'll just give you a little context. So an average legislative year, you see roughly just under about 2,000 bills introduced. And obviously those, certainly work their way through the process and they stall. And so you don't normally see that level or that number of bills that go to the governor's desk. But it's usually pretty substantial, well over 1,000 that the governor will see. The governor is poised to act on, I believe, about 500 bills this year. So it just speaks to, the fact that there just wasn't a lot of opportunity in this very truncated session to really advance a lot of meaningful policies. And certainly, as I know I reported on many prior webinars and conversations with a lot of you, there just wasn't a lot of enthusiasm to move forward bills that that the legislature did not feel required an immediate fix. So 500 is pretty modest for cannabis. We went from about 36 bills that were introduced in January, and all but 6 are now pending action on the governor's desk. So in that time frame, we saw about 30 bills go away, either because they were dropped by the author to try to meet the objective of streamlining bill packages, which was a request by the leaders in both the Assembly and the Senate. But then if also committee chairs of various policy committees in the legislature also deemed that an author didn't need to move a bill forward, they had a lot of discretion to also refuse to hear bills. And so we saw a lot of that really begin to happen around the April and March timeframe. And I remember I was on COVID weekly calls with all of you where I was saying, okay, well, last week we had 36 bills and now we have 28, and I think we'll have 11. And that was really, that was something we experienced. It was a gradual progression, but I think the fact that we have 6, I think was somewhat of an achievement, for the sheer fact that there were so few bills remaining in the final few weeks. So with that said, I'll talk a little bit about what was left and what's pending action by the governor.
Amy, can I interject here? Because I'm curious to know, we got a directive probably in April or so that in terms of the bill load, that the legislature or really more the governor was not interested in signing anything that didn't have to deal with COVID, homelessness, or wildfires.
Correct.
Overall, do you feel like that's kind of where the bill packages are headed?
No.
Okay, interesting.
No. Well, because we also saw a lot of other things happen. There was a real attention to, social justice related reform.
Sure.
So we saw a lot of issues around that, public safety, funding of law enforcement. I think, as we began to experience other things that were happening around us, the legislature continually pivoted and adjusted in accordance with what was really happening day to day. I think ultimately we saw a lot more legislation on various subjects. throughout the year it wasn't so focused, but I do think there was a concerted effort at the onset to try to limit it to those major policy topics, as you said: homelessness and housing, COVID and pandemic relief, as well as wildfires. But again, as different things happened throughout the course of the year, there was a lot more interest in adjusting and pivoting. So yeah, we saw a whole host of bills at the very tail end of the year. And in fact, I think if you were to read a lot of the, the commentary right now of folks that are really trying to make sense of this odd, truncated, highly unusual session, there were probably more bills that were held in the final day. I mean, huge policy bills that probably shouldn't have been. A lot of key objectives of the administration and both houses did not move. And I think it was just the product of, again, having to deal with constant crises and crisis management, and just general frustration amongst the houses. And so there were just a lot of different dynamics at the very end. So again, the fact that we had 6 move forward probably is a good thing. We worked very, very hard to move these forward. These are modest changes, but I think we're poised to do a lot of good work next year. Obviously, with the contemplating what will happen with COVID and what the legislative session will ultimately look like, I think we're poised to do a lot more work, and hopefully that will happen. So with respect to bills that were sent, so really we just saw 6 bills. So 6 bills ultimately went to the governor. The first is appellations of origin, and this was one that was had very broad support. There were some concerns at the onset, but overall, I think the majority of industry strongly supported and got behind this bill by Senator McGuire. And this involves the appellations of origin program that's under development through the California Department of Food and Agriculture to develop appellations of origin for cannabis. It'll be the first of its kind nationally and globally to have a program for cannabis. And what this bill essentially does is it provides kind of 2 parallel mechanisms to designate where your cannabis came from. So first, it preserves the terroir baseline for appellations of origin. So if you are an outdoor cultivator, there will be a process developed whereby an appellation of origin can be established that factors in, again, terroir standards. So grown in soil, in ground, in natural sunlight, using no artificial lighting, and really embracing the topography. But the other thing that makes this bill so important and why there was so much support is it also recognizes the fact that county of origin, which is currently permissible, really doesn't hone in on some of the very specialized regions where we are commercially authorized to cultivate and develop products. And so there was a need to develop a city of origin designation. So this is not necessarily an appellation as defined in the wine industry, but this would allow for a parallel city of origin designation for those cannabis cultivators and manufacturers that are producing products in more urban settings and not growing outdoors. So this was approved overwhelmingly. It has been sent to the governor's office, and there's every indication that he will sign this bill. He has until September 30th to act. So that is pending his review. We also saw 3 bills in the area of quality assurance and testing. The first one is AB 1458 Quirk. And this was sponsored by the California Cannabis Manufacturers Association and strongly supported by CCIA. This raises the label variance threshold for edible products from plus or minus 10% to plus or minus 12% until January 1, 2022. And this is really, again, to give time for labs to really develop those testing protocols. I think the argument was that there needed to be a higher variance threshold over a 2-year period, and so that has been sent to the governor's office. There was no opposition to this bill. If I'm not mistaken, it flew out with 0 no votes and is pending action by the governor. AB 1470 also by Assemblymember Quirk and also sponsored by the California Cannabis Manufacturers Association, redefines final form essentially for purposes of cannabis testing by clarifying that the products can be tested without being in their final retail packaging. I think it's important to note that this bill did get amended on September 4th. And those amendments made clear that this would not apply to vaping products. So cannabis vapes will still need to be in the cartridge. That was not the original intent of the bill, but there was some pushback, I believe, from agency. They want to continue to test cannabis vaping products in their actual vape cartridge and with all the hardware.
Hey there, it looks like Amy's audio or video might have frozen on us. Are you back?
Oh,
There you
I'm
are.
here.
It just froze for 1 second.
Oh, sorry, guys. I didn't notice that. I was just talking away. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
You're good.
Okay. So I covered 1470. Hopefully I don't have to cover that. Okay. So the next bill is SB 1244 by Senator Stephen Bradford. This bill was sponsored by the city of Los Angeles. We were happy to support the bill. It authorizes a testing laboratory to receive and test samples from state and local law enforcement and prosecutorial agencies. This is really intended to provide investigators at the local level a little more clarity. Apparently, there's been some differing interpretations about whether a testing lab can test products that are provided by law enforcement, since the law is very specific right now that they can test products from for personal use by a member of the public and also from a licensed distributor. But City of LA felt they needed that clarity for purposes of conducting investigation against unlicensed activity. So that bill is pending action by Governor Newsom. Next slide, please. Thanks, Eddie. Hopefully I'm not putting you all to sleep. So the next bill is AB 1525 by Assemblymember Joan Sawyer. This bill there's been a lot of questions about this bill and a lot of concerns raised. Full disclosure, the California Cannabis Industry Association, along with some other affiliates, were pleased to support this bill. There have been some concerns raised about it being a data collection bill, and I certainly appreciate some of the concerns. We did a lot of due diligence when we were examining this bill, and that included extensive conversations with the author. We engaged in communications with regulators and operators in Washington, and we also worked in partnership with the California Credit Union League and the California Bankers Association, who really felt that they needed this bill. What it essentially does is it allows a licensee to authorize certain data sharing of specific financial information to state and local agencies, but only at the express written consent or consent of that licensee. So let me back up just very quickly. What this essentially attempts to do is to establish a process whereby financial institutions can more readily meet the federal FinCEN requirements, which essentially means they have to know their customer. And so what is happening in the field in our communications with a lot of our members is that financial institutions are asking for certain financial information, largely to determine whether the transactions that are taking place in Metric are actually legal transactions. And so what this would do is authorize the state as well as local governments, again, at the express consent of a licensee to share that information with a financial institution. This bill is modeled after legislation that was enacted in Washington in 2018. And what we have seen and what we've been told is that about 90% of the industry is now banked up there. It was also part of the state treasurer's working group recommendations. So for those of you who want to like reach back 3 years, then Treasurer John Chung developed a series of recommendations as part of a cannabis banking working group. And this was also one of those recommendations. So again, we had a lot of conversations about this bill and felt that, again, the way the language was written in that it provides protections for the licensee, and also the licensee has to verify that they want this information shared. We were comfortable supporting this bill. I do expect that there might be some questions about this bill, and I'm more than happy to get into more details about that. I've also had a lot of questions offline, and I'm happy to have offline conversations with any of you that might be interested in a little bit more clarity around this bill and what its intent is. That bill did pass and is pending review by the governor.
Thank you for that, Amy. I know we are also trying to put together a brief webinar with the author's office and some additional colleagues to help educate members around the practical application of 1525, because we know that there's been some misinformation out there, and we want to make sure that our members understand what this will actually mean for license holders. So stay tuned for that. Eddie, I think you're receiving some questions in the chat function. If folks do want to add in any questions at any time, you can either use the questions tab or the chat tab. I think the questions come to me and the chats go to Eddie, but feel free to insert some of those right now if the timing seems right, Eddie.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is actually on the previous slide. Some folks popped them in after. First question is from Vera on AB 1470. She asks, will this change the COA requirements to eliminate retail packaging image?
You know, it's funny. You're the second person that asked me that question today, and I don't know the answer. I don't. Somebody called me shortly before this webinar to ask me about the practical implementation changes that are going to be required with this bill. And it would seem to me, Vera, that I need to do a lot more due diligence in terms of what the administration envisions and how this will be implemented. Again, there is certainly the possibility that the administration is not going to sign it, but there's been enough questions around what this means from a practical standpoint that I think I need to go back and really try to walk through with the regulatory agencies what their vision is. Now, I will say with one caveat, and that is a lot of times they won't talk to me about that level of specificity until the bill is signed, but there was enough curiosity about this bill just 30 minutes before this webinar to prompt me to really think about how this is going to work. And my guess is if it gets signed, there's going to need to be some guidance. So if you would be willing and so kind as to share your email with Eddie, as some of you will know, I'm really good about getting back, and I will make sure I follow up on that question for you.
Awesome. Thanks, Amy.
Great.
Yeah.
I'm going to have Eddie moderate this part since he's got visibility on the questions.
Yeah, we're having some technical issue with the question panes, folks. So sorry for
okay.
I'm the one who has the visuals on it. So next question is from Karen Woodson. She asks, is there any concern that SB 1244 will create backup or delays for cannabis retailers who are working with existing labs?
That's a really good question. It has not come up in the context of any communications that I've had, and the QC committee that's part of CCIA, our policy committee, did not raise that as an issue. Having said that, though, it's a good question. I don't know what the current time frame is, and if people are still experiencing backlogs. It's not been brought to my attention as of late, but I think it's a reasonable question. More broadly, I will say, and this doesn't directly answer your question, but it's just some information I'm aware of, is that I know, as I've heard, is that there seems to be some backlog with testing labs in terms of BCC license processing. I've been starting to get a lot of calls and hearing about that. And I know there's a real commitment to get more labs online and operational, but I hadn't contemplated the bill in that context. So I think it's a reasonable question. And Eddie, maybe we can bring it up as a discussion item with our QC committee.
Absolutely.
Thank you for the question.
We have a question that came in from our wonderful board member, Julie Crockett. What is the ETA for bill signing?
Thanks, Julie. So the governor has 30 days. So by September 30th, the governor will have needed to act. And just a point to note, if the governor doesn't sign a bill or veto a bill, it means that automatically just takes effect. This governor, at least in his first year, pretty much had a signing message for every bill and weighed in on every bill. So I'm pretty confident that he will take action on all of them before that timeline. And given the fact that we have so few or so few bills than in prior years, I expect he will act as expeditiously as possible.
Awesome. And then the final question we've got is from Sam. Under AB 1525, what entities are eligible to make the request for data from licensees? Can a local law enforcement, for example, make a request?
No, let me clarify that. So right now, the language in the bill, the request would have to come from the licensee. So the licensee would have to ask a local agency to share specified data that is requested by the financial institution. It's not the other way around. So a local agency would not be permitted to share any of your financial information, assuming that local agency is even tracking that, without your express consent as a licensee. So it's the reverse than what you're asking. This would
Awesome.
all be at the request of the licensee. I know there's a lot of concerns out there about the type of data collection that is already underway by certain local government agencies. I've been tracking that as a CCIA for some time. Sadly, that is those are local. There's nothing that precludes them from collecting information. It's just this provides an opportunity to share that with a financial institution, but only at your request.
Great, thanks, Eddie. Just ping me if we get more questions. Yeah. We have less than 20 minutes, so I'm just going to flag that. Although the budget trailer bill is one of our most exciting.
Yeah, let me run through. Yeah, this was our fun project. So AB 1872 was introduced as a budget trailer bill in the final 2 weeks of session. This was a really exciting project. I will say that I was very pleased to work on beginning in May. It was all done very quietly between myself on behalf of CCIA and the Senate and Assembly budget staff. But you know, we had made a lot of noise last year when we received the announcement from CDTFA that they were going to be increasing the cannabis tax rate markups for the excise tax and the cultivation tax for inflation. So we were very excited about the opportunity to work with them to at least freeze that authority. So what will happen this year is in 2021 is the existing tax rates will remain the same. We will not experience any sort of markup to the excise tax or any COLA inflationary adjustment for the cultivation tax. So we can expect a little bit of certainty and stability in calendar year 2021. For those of you who might be asking, you know, why just a 1 year? I think politically and strategically, in talking with budget staff, look, there's a real desire to help this industry, to help cannabis. We've got a lot of really big fans in the legislature who understand the circumstances that we are all experiencing and want to be helpful. So I think the thought was, if we do a 2-year freeze, it just gives an excuse for people to say, oh, they're covered for 2 years. So we want to do a 1 year, and we want to continue on this path of really trying to explore and pursue some tax reform for the industry. Just another quick thing it does is it does expand some local grant eligibility criteria, so more locals can actually tap into one of the many grant programs that are offered that's funded through Prop 64 funds. I added this in here because I think there's a lot of misinformation about what actually this grant is, and I think there's some opportunities for the industry, and I'm going to be working with the CCIA board on how we kind of weigh in. But this local public safety grant program actually for local governments doesn't just fund local public safety programs. The way it's actually been implemented is it will also fund public health, environmental mitigation opportunities, as well as youth programming. But in talking to Nicole Elliott and others, we think there might be some opportunities for the industry to actually benefit from these grants if that money is allocated to cities and counties. So we're going to be exploring this in a lot more detail, I think, over the fall. So we were happy to expand some of that eligibility criteria so more communities could access those funds. Next slide, please. Lindsay, this is your show.
That's me. Okay, great. Well, I will make this pretty brief because I think that most people have, hopefully folks have had the opportunity to go back and take a look at the federal webinars that we have done with the liaison group. And if not, I recommend that, and we'll probably be doing another one this fall. So stay tuned for that, but we did want to slip it in because obviously banking has been a huge issue for CCIA since we started working with the liaison group a couple years ago, and we've put a ton of energy into that focus in 2020. So as some of you may recall, we have been working with the California delegation to really activate Pelosi on including safe banking in a COVID relief package, which we were successful in, and actually we have been credited as helping to move that needle. So I appreciate all of our members' hard work. And making sure that we, that we're activating our membership and reaching out to our delegates to let them know how crucial banking is for our industry. This is obviously one of those bigger problems that really needs a federal solution. So with that, we obviously know that it was banking was moved into the HEROES Act, which came out of the House and unfortunately has basically stalled. Currently, there is a gridlock essentially with any COVID relief packages moving forward, which is really unfortunate. It's also a really delicate balance advocating on behalf of banking when our country is in such turmoil and having such difficulty passing simple relief packages that people so desperately need. We are still staying engaged in the conversation and obviously will continue to play a role. And just last month, actually, we did a NASCAR style letter to again just show the unity and solidarity of cannabis operators in California and how important banking is for public safety, but also for these businesses as we start to think about economic recovery in the state and job creation and tax revenue. So we'll keep everyone posted. I wish I had rosier news on the federal front, but you all know what the deal is over there. So again, I think that Eddie, if you'll pop back to that just real quick. Thank you. MORE Act. So there is a little bit of excitement moving forward. The MORE Act essentially deschedules cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act and would decriminalize pending and retroactive convictions and allow states to set up their own policies related to cannabis. It has really robust social equity applications, and we're excited to be supporting the MORE Act. It will hopefully be voted on in the House in the next couple weeks. Stay tuned for a call to action for our members to sign on to a coalition letter in support of the MORE Act. Unfortunately, we are not anticipating a lot of movement on the Senate side. But what I think we will see, and sort of building for our 2021 priorities and continuing to work with the liaison group, is that this will kind of set a benchmark of where cannabis policy reform should be headed, and the importance of including social equity and a really robust system that allows the states to decide, but has kind of overall protections, and a huge social equity component, which I think is going to be vital. So we're excited to be seeing that move, hopefully, and we will be activating our membership to lend their support and their voice to that federal effort. So that's it. Like I said, we'll probably be doing more soon, but I'll keep it short today.
So thanks, Lindsay. So I want to kind of segue into where we are, kind of where we left off when session gavelled down about 1:30 in the morning on September 1st, and talk about what we think is on the horizon. And I think there's a lot of this is pretty well confirmed at this point. I don't think there's a lot of speculation, but I think it's really important because there's going to be a lot of pressing policy issues that we're going to have to be engaged in, and your input and expectations as to the direction that we need to go as an organization is going to be incredibly important. I did note early in the presentation that I expect next year to be incredibly busy, and this gives you a snapshot. So I want to just talk really quickly about cannabis vaping, because we did dodge a bullet this year. We did not see any efforts, least viable efforts, to ban cannabis vaping products. So that was a real threat at the beginning of the year. But there's enough input and dialogue in the legislature where I'm pretty certain we are going to see something. And so I think the board is going to have to figure out what our position is going to be on these issues. They're not going away. So two points I'll note. So both of the bills that are cited in the left-hand column are one actually was signed by the governor, SB 793. This only applied to tobacco products, but I think it's important to mention it because it banned artificial flavors, because it was signed by the governor immediately after it was sent to him. However, over the course of this very hotly debated bill, there was not a single hearing in the legislature or a floor debate where cannabis was not mentioned, and where the author was not criticized by a handful of legislators for not incorporating cannabis hemp products into this artificial flavoring ban. We were very fortunate that Senator Jerry Hill, though, was very supportive of us and felt that there was major distinctions. Nonetheless, Adam Gray did introduce a bill and amended in July to ban artificial flavoring in cannabis vaping products. We anticipate him to reintroduce a bill next year. So we will be having some extensive deliberations on how we want to proceed as an industry and as an organization. Other statutory changes, again, we've talked a lot about tax reduction and tax reform. Those will come up again. Agency consolidation is poised to be part of the budget process next year. The provisional license program extension and CEQA. I am already being contacted by environmental groups and will be meeting with them on behalf of CCIA to better inform that community as to why the provisional license program extension is so vitally important. It expires July 1 of 2021. Social equity, we emphasized earlier. I think there's going to be a lot more work around social equity. There was a bill that was approved in 2019 to establish a program whereby social equity applicants could have their fees waived. That has not been fully implemented. And then hemp. As we all know, hemp has taken center stage in the last couple of weeks. And so we should fully anticipate seeing a hemp framework introduced next year. In fact, those conversations are already beginning to commence following the end of session. So let's talk about hemp, since there's been such controversy around hemp as of late. Let's talk a little bit about this and what happened. And I know we're running out of time, but I'm happy to stay over for a while.
Yeah, I would like to invite people to stick around if the conversation goes over, because this is a really important piece and we wanted to dedicate significant time to it. Also, feel free to send in questions, but hopefully we'll cover a lot in the next 10 minutes or so.
Yeah, so let's talk about hemp. So for about 2 years, there has been a coalition of folks, actually which began with the cannabis industry. It was cannabis retailers and a handful of cannabis manufacturers back in 2018, before the hemp industry was really organized, really wanted to have a conversation about hemp for two reasons. One, the retailers wanted to sell these products, and a lot of manufacturers wanted to use hemp derivatives and cannabinoids in cannabis products, and all of that was precluded in regs. So initial conversations really began and by the hemp community, or the cannabis community, and then what we saw in 2019 was the hemp industry getting more organized. So there's two primary groups in Sacramento. One is the U.S. Hemp Roundtable, and one is the California Hemp Council. And those two groups have spent the better part of the last 2 years, 2019 and 2020, really aggressively lobbying for a regulatory framework for the lawful manufacture and retail sale of hemp. There was a bill that was introduced, AB 228, by Cecilia Aguirre Curry back in 2019, and that bill stalled at the end of last year, but the hemp community kept pushing forward, as did the author. So with respect to our role as an association, we felt it was incredibly important to stay engaged in this conversation, as it does impact cannabis. And we did have a lot of members that were very interested from the retail perspective and from the manufacturing perspective. You guys have heard me say this many times. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu, and we felt it important to be part of those conversations. So for the most part, those conversations largely died over the 2020 calendar year. The hemp industry continued to push for a framework. CCIA was frankly not terribly involved at the early part of this year. In fact, not really involved at all until the final few weeks of session, when the hemp conversations really began to ramp up. And so ultimately, from a timing standpoint, what happened is about a week before the end of session, there was some indication that the administration was poised to contemplate a framework after very extensive lobbying by the hemp industry, not the cannabis industry, but the hemp industry. And so essentially, we were invited to go back in and engage in some of those conversations. So the board, ultimately, we opted to do that. Again, we felt it was important. And so we played a role in somewhat in the development of the framework, albeit not perfect. So here's kind of where it was left off in terms of the language. And I know there's a lot of language that has been shared, probably an RN number you'll see, but it's important to note that this language never actually got amended into the bill. But I think it should be pointed out that this will in large part be kind of the framework for the beginning of new discussions, which again, I believe are already beginning to resume around this topic. So what the framework did is it, again, it established a framework for manufacturing and retail sale. It established various criteria, COAs, proof of state and federal compliance requirements. I want to really emphasize prohibited products in a second. This has been very controversial. It did outline prohibited products, including processed smokable products and flour. So short version, no hemp vapes, no hemp flour under this framework. It would be prohibited. The language does currently largely mirror cannabis labeling and advertising standards. They pulled almost directly from MCRSA. It also outlines some enforcement standards, application requirements, general fee structure, record keeping, and then establishes a new hemp enrollment and oversight fund that would largely be dedicated to studying hemp efficacy at the university system. So that is really a basic overview. Obviously, there's a lot of complexity to this. We could do a whole webinar on hemp, which I'm more than happy to do. But that was the general framework that was presented. So let's go to the next slide. And let me try to provide a little bit of an overview here. So when we were first invited to participate in these discussions, and again, it was about a 5-day discussion period. That was about all the time we had because the legislature was concluding session. We were invited largely at the request of the author, because I think the author, Cecilia Aguirre-Curry, felt that the hemp industry needed to have some level of representation. But I also think it's safe to say that cannabis and the cannabis industry was not really contemplated in this framework. And so I think there was some benefits to being at the table, because we felt as a CCIA that we needed that voice. We needed to help shape and frame this. And we also need some commitments. If there's going to be a robust framework for hemp rolled out in California, you have to have the cannabis industry present. So some of the things that we really pushed for, the first one being the removal of the age restriction and an interstate commerce ban. This was done with the whole coalition. We felt that this was a step back. After all, hemp is cannabis, cannabis is hemp. And we did not feel that these requirements which were presented by the administration were appropriate. So we did advocate to have that eliminated in the language. But we also strongly advocated for testing parity. Now, to clarify that, there were early iterations of 228 that did not have complete testing parity with cannabis. And I think as cannabis has evolved, the industry's evolved, and we've all grown accustomed to testing, I think there was a lot of sensitivity that testing parity was really important. And so we actually, as CCIA, really pushed the hemp community to embrace our testing standards. So testing parity was very clearly outlined in the language, or is clearly outlined in the language. Also, because of the prohibited products section in the bill, which CCIA found extremely problematic, we did push for, and it was one of the last amendments taken, for an express exemption of cannabis and cannabis products from that prohibited product language, because we didn't want to be inadvertently captured in that language in any way. And to be clear about the prohibited products section, and I'm really passionate about this because I fought incredibly hard against the prohibited products. And what I learned in the course of those conversations, and this was with the support of CCIA's board, is that the Department of Public Health does not currently regulate those products and did not want to stand up a segment of the Department of Public Health to begin regulating those products. So after repeated attempts where I would try to strike that language in negotiations, they kept putting it back in. But that was a very big push on our part. We did not feel that that was appropriate, but I did get the language in for us. With respect to the cannabis industry, we wanted a lot more dialogue and incorporation of things around cannabis retail sales of these products. There was a desire to incorporate language that would allow for the infusion of hemp CBD into manufactured cannabis products. What we were told is that those conversations will occur, and that there was a general commitment to have those just conversations during the process of consolidation. So as the agencies are consolidating, those are some things that we're going to be prepared to talk about. So in the meantime, we advocated to have language stipulated or put in the bill that essentially would require some collaboration with our licensing entities. We don't feel that this should be siloed. And also we added language. This was also hard fought, to prepare a report by the licensing entities outlining a process for the incorporation of hemp into the cannabis supply chain. We also advocated very strongly to delay the implementation date of this to May 1, and that was particularly in the context of the prohibited products, to give folks the opportunity and time to try to negotiate with the administration and others an opportunity or a pathway to allow those products to be sold in California. So that is a really, really quick and dirty overview. Obviously, I can get into a lot more detail, time permitting, but we thought it was important to cover that. I'll just close by saying the association has been very transparent about this process. I think we were pleased to be at the table and to have the opportunity to engage in these discussions. And the one last thing I will say about that is, in the course of these conversations, we made it extremely clear that whatever was going to be negotiated for the hemp industry needed to be considered for the cannabis industry, because as we know, this is much more streamlined than what we experience under MRCRSA. And we were very prepared and poised to continue those conversations into next year as we are having, dialogue and lobbying around consolidation. So that was really kind of part of that and the rationale for that participation. So I'll stop there. I'm assuming, Lindsay, you might want to add anything or add something.
Sure, and I think there might be some questions trickling in. I appreciate folks staying over with us. This is obviously, it is lobbying and negotiations around bill language is really challenging. And this was a very truncated, abbreviated time period for us to do that. And as the only stakeholders in the room, we felt utterly responsible to have the cannabis voice be heard. And that was our prime motivation. It was our only motivation. And I think that it's obviously complex and there's a lot of rumors and misinformation out there. But as our members, we want to address this with you directly, that we lobby for our members, and all of our members are listed on our website. We have complete transparency. All of our funding comes from our members. You can see who our board of directors are. You can take a look at Amy's other clients that she works with. We have full transparency, and we have always had full transparency. That is part of our commitment as CCIA. So, we just want to stress and reiterate that, we build our legislative priorities on the work that we do with our members. And so as we dig in for 2021, we know that there is going to be tension in the industry and there's going to be divisiveness, but it is important that we stand together and we present a unified voice in Sacramento, because I can guarantee you that divisiveness is not helping our agenda and the bills that we want to move. So, I take this as an opportunity for folks to really engage or re-engage with CCIA, and to be involved with our committees and run for the board and be a part of this democratic process, because it's vital and we can't do this work without you. And we're really proud to do it. Amy and I work extremely hard every day to make sure that you all are represented. And it is work that we're proud of. So we invite that engagement, though. If you ever have questions, you can always reach out to us. We're pretty accessible. And, I think we've had really meaningful conversations, some very difficult conversations, as this year has gone a little bit sideways with ledge priorities. And we recognized that we were not going to get tax reduction, and we weren't going to get these core principles that we have been fighting for years, that have been in our ledge platform for years. It was a hard year. And I think that 2021 is, hopefully we will have more clarity and we will have more unity, and we will be able to really step it up in terms of our advocacy. And I'm looking forward to that. I'm hopeful, but I'm always weirdly optimistically hopeful. It's the only way you can stay in this industry for as long as I have. So Eddie, let's see if there's any questions. I would love to take some if we haven't already answered them, because I know some of what Amy just went through probably touched on some of that stuff.
Yeah, actually, we only have one question outside of what Amy has already answered in these awesome slides. This is from Jocelyn Kane. Jocelyn asks, who is the licensing or regulatory authority for hemp?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Jocelyn. Good to see your name pop up. So the hemp framework assumed the Department of Public Health's Food and Drug branch. So that is the existing branch that is charged with regulating food, beverages, dietary supplements. So they would be the primary department within the Department of Public Health. So whereas we're part of the Manufactured Cannabis Safety branch. And so the intent was again to kind of sweep hemp under that existing framework. I think that is what they're poised to do even in conversations next year. And while you didn't ask this question, Jocelyn, it's also why, again, prohibited products include smokable, because that existing department doesn't have any jurisdiction or oversight over smokable products currently. So they were trying to kind of fit hemp into that framework. And I think, again, that is still going to be the goal next year. In communicating with staff at the Cannabis Manufactured Safety Branch, it did become fairly apparent to me, and I'm speaking for myself, that there was a lot of communication between the two entities, but the framework definitely assumes a different division.
Great, thanks. Any final questions from anyone? If not, Eddie, is there anything else on there?
One popped up again that was asked a little earlier, and I think we talked about it a bit, but happy to reiterate a bit. Is there, Abram Yoakum from Weird Science asks, is there any movement or consideration to allow California cannabis licensees to be able to manufacture hemp CBD in the same facility?
Yeah. Oh, I didn't really mention that. Thank you, Abram, for raising that question and that issue. Yes, that if you look at, actually, it wasn't ever in. There was a framework that was drafted early on that assumed what we called co-location, and this was late last year because there was a lot of interest from our cannabis manufacturers in actually manufacturing hemp products in the same facility. That is definitely something too that will be discussed next year. I raised it many times during the course of the negotiations, which were quite intense, that was something that needed to occur. Obviously, the three primaries were that, the co-location, co-mingling, as I kind of like to call it, but that's the infusion of hemp into cannabis manufactured products, and then the retail sale. So those are the three elements that we, as CCIA, presented based on input from our members, and that will definitely be part of the dialogue next year.
Thanks, Abram. And it looks like we are done with questions. So thank you, everyone, for sticking it out an extra 11 minutes with us.
Sorry about that.
Now
I was being too verbose.
No, this is where we get the good info. So, you know, I think it's important to create these access points for our members. I want to thank Amy, obviously, for all of your hard work. Legislative session is over. You can take a break a little bit, maybe, as we recharge for 2021. You know, your dedication to this is greatly appreciated. Thank you to the CCIA staff, Eddie Franco, Justin McCarthy, Josh Drayton. I'm super grateful for our board, who's very, very hands-on. And we have extensive meetings and conversations with to help lead this amazing association. I'm always grateful for their leadership and insight. And yeah, and to all of our members, we're really glad that you guys could come and hang out with us today, and hopefully you found this informative. And if you have additional questions, let us know. You know where to find us. I will also say too, committee open enrollment is going to start in early October. If you're a business or executive level member or associate plus, please get involved with our committees. It is a vital opportunity for you to share your thoughts and help shape the policies and priorities that we fight for. And that's really what we're going to be doing over the next couple of months is building for 2021. And we'll keep you all posted. We're going to have a very robust season of educational webinars, so stay tuned and get involved. And yeah, we appreciate you all very much. Thanks again, Amy.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay, talk soon.
Bye.